There you go.
Awesome. Well, I guess that's our cue, everyone. So welcome to the second Disability as Diversity Book Club session. This book club is brought to you by the Docs With Disabilities Initiative in partnership with AHEAD. So just kind of as a little bit of background, the initiative uses research, education, and sharing of stories to drive change in healthcare education with an overall aim to build a more inclusive educational environment for trainees with disabilities and also to increase representation of disabled providers in the healthcare workforce. The goal of the Disability as Diversity Book Club is to introduce varied perspectives and encourage empathy for all stakeholders in a healthcare setting. Together, we'll work through multiple cases, today of which we're going through case number 2, and empowering DRPs with varied perspectives and resources that boost confidence to work through some of these complex situations that you may have seen or will see in the future. My name is Samantha Schroth, and I am a medical student and actually a dual degree, so MD, PhD student at Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine in downtown Chicago, Illinois. And I'm really excited to be here with you today and really thank you for choosing to spend the next hour with us. I'll let my partner, Emily McGee, introduce herself in a second. But as was mentioned, so today's session is going to be recorded, at least in this beginning section. And then at the end of the case debrief, there will be further time for question and answer. And then at that point in time, we'll end the recording to really encourage further discussion. And we really encourage you to participate so we can learn from each other. And I think that's what makes this book club so exciting, is that we have all of these people from across the country with varied perspectives and experiences that we can come together and really learn from one each other to make and really combat ableism in medicine. So here, I'll turn the mic over to Emily.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emily McGee. I am the Director of Student Disability Services at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia. I am so excited to be here with you all today to go through this case with you all and to learn from you and to gain your perspectives as well as we talk through this. And I am sharing my screen. I'm going to do my very best to keep up with the chat and the Q&A and all of that. So please bear with me as much as possible. We also want to say a huge thank you to all of the contributing authors. Without their incredible work, without people sharing their stories, we would not have this invaluable resource for you all today that we're sharing as part of this book club. So thank you so much to all of those contributors. And then just some reminders that this is a space for learning and connecting. No one has all the answers. Questions are welcomed at all levels. As they say, there are no stupid questions. So please, if you have it, ask it. Remember to be mindful of your contribution time to ensure opportunities for others to share and to connect. This isn't a space for individual or group consulting regarding current student situations. And we also want to remember to navigate this space with humility and respect. We're all peers here, and we are here to learn from each other. And it was mentioned a bit earlier as far as how to engage in the discussion with us, because we want to hear from all of you. And so one way to do that is to use the raise hand feature. We'll then unmute you and allow you to share your really important contribution. Or if you would like to put something in the chat, please do. We're probably going to ask for some, initial thoughts in that chat as well. So have your typing fingers ready for us. But if you've got a question and you don't want to maybe necessarily unmute, feel free to put it in the Q&A. Again, we're all here to learn from each other. So please share your unique experiences and perspectives with us. All right.
All right, and so now we're going to kick off kind of into the case history. Assuming everyone has read the case within the book, regardless, we're still going to give you a little of the key history and the key points. And I think an important thing to recognize about all of the cases that were in the book is that these are real stories or situations that have happened, maybe altered slightly, but these are very real situations. So, we are addressing an experience or going through some things that people have indeed experienced. So it's very helpful and very relevant. good. So some of the key points of the case that we're going to be discussing is about Tammy, who is a C6, C7 complete quadriplegic. So she uses a power wheelchair in terms of her mobility and functions independently with minimal assistance. So she has limited hand dexterity, her core balance, and use of the lower extremities. Additionally, the DRP is unfamiliar with some of the different clinical accommodations that she may necessarily need. And then we'll go to the next slide. And then now, so thinking, especially as I currently am a student, I think it's important to consider some of the different perspectives that that are occurring within this case itself. So when we consider some of what the perspectives of the student, of Tammy, would be, it's likely possible that she's going to be feeling pretty overwhelmed by the increased needs of some of these clerkships and some of these rotations, especially things that would require increased dexterity, like OB-GYN or surgery. And then maybe also some of the lack of accessibility of outpatient clinics. Power wheelchairs can be a little bit wider in size, and some of those clinical exam rooms are not very large. And so how accessible are these clinics for her to be able to utilize and actually treat and see patients? And then additionally, the additional time it takes to complete professional tasks due to her disability, like performing that physical exam or writing notes, and some of the accommodations that she may need, such as dictation software, that kind of thing. And then the additional time it just takes to complete everyday tasks due to her disability, whether it's using the bathroom or having to navigate around the hospital, taking elevators, that may take a little bit more time than just, say, taking the stairs. Additional concerns about physical limitations that may decrease some of her participation in some of those core clerkships, like pap smears, vaginal deliveries, and C-sections, and maybe even just discomfort about her ability to perform those, what it would look like, the other people in the room while those things are going on. And then feelings of isolation as the only person in the program with an obvious physical disability. Sitting in a power wheelchair isn't something you can exactly hide. So having to feel a little bit, like you're always standing out, and what would that mean and how would that impact the way that she presents herself? And then as a newly injured student, she's still learning the self-advocacy tools and maybe feels an extra burden to have to navigate clinical accommodations independently, doesn't want to burden anyone, a number of those perspectives that would be adding additional pressure to her as a student that many of her peers have never had to consider.
Yeah, so we've thought about the student perspective. So now let's think about the perspective of the faculty. So wheelchair accessibility and the barriers in the clinic, ensuring the same modification of procedures and physical exams. Geez Louise. And then identifying which procedures Tammy can complete independently and supporting her development in these procedures. After thinking about the perspective of the faculty, we want to think about the perspective of the DRP. So do the program's technical standards support accommodations / modifications? What are the clinical program requirements? What are the physical barriers in the various clinical sites? What would some specific services provide better learning experiences than others? What assistive technology will the student require? And then who can help us to answer these questions? Right? Because we're not always in a bubble. We don't do these things in isolation. We work with others in order to come up with the best solution for a student, or the most appropriate accommodations.
So let's start diving in, let's get into actually starting this process about, thinking about the situation that the student is experiencing. So what do we know? What do we need to know? And how and where can we find the information that would ultimately allow us to have that increased access that Tammy needs?
Yeah, so let's start with question number 1. How would your institution's technical standards impact Tammy?
Now, this is a time that we would love for you to be able to share and consider within the context of this case, how what your response to this question would be. And again, as was mentioned before, feel free to put your answer in the chat, put your answer in the Q&A section, or raise your hand, and we would love to call on you.
I cannot get my top ribbon to show me what the chat looks like. So sorry, everyone, if you're typing in there.
I'm not currently seeing anything in the chat. Maybe we can even open it up to be a little bit more broad about, general even awareness of technical standards and what that would look like are you aware of your institution's technical standards, and what that would look like for a student like Tammy to attend your institution. Would she even be allowed to attend your institution, depending upon what your technical standards are?
There we go. All right. So we've got a response in the Q&A that our technical standards are written in an organic format, very ability-based and not friendly for Tammy. So if you're noticing that, we could be proactive possibly, and one of the resources that we're going to share at the end is a link to a AAMC webinar about technical standards, because this is such a hugely important topic that we need to be speaking about. So I think if your technical standards aren't going to be very friendly for Tammy, then we want to be thinking about what can we do to increase that access. I've got another comment that is ours say that they must have sufficient motor function and coordination of gross and fine muscular movements, etc. So that's also going to be a issue for Tammy, isn't it? As we've shared, part of the barriers that she experiences are in some of those motor functions. And Brandy has shared a quote from, I'm going to presume your technical standards themselves. And they say, a candidate should be able to execute motor movements reasonably required to provide general care, osteopathic manipulation, and emergency treatment to patients. Examples of emergency treatment reasonably required of physicians are cardiopulmonary resuscitation, the administration of intravenous medication, the application of pressure to stop bleeding, the opening of obstructed airways, the suturing of simple wounds, and the performance of simple obstetrical maneuvers. So when I see examples, that always makes me a little wary because we're never going to cover everything. And maybe not everything is necessarily required. So I think that that's, again, going back into that interactive process. And that's really important of why do we need to be able to perform this? And, are there other hospital staff who would be available who could assist in this or who would regularly be performing these tasks?
And while this certainly isn't a webinar on technical standards specifically, but I will indeed, just want to highlight how great the AAMC Technical Standards webinar is. I think it's a really important topic, especially when we think about Tammy or other students that have some sort of mobility disability and have some sort of alteration of their motor function, whether it's in their lower extremities or upper extremities. The importance of really considering and taking time to review what your school's technical standards are. Oftentimes now, the push is for competency-based standards. And if students are able to be competently perform things, and it isn't based on these organic standards. And I think that's something really important to consider and reflect upon at your own institution, if that could be something that could be addressed and evaluated. And there is that beautiful toolkit of even how to go about meeting by meeting and addressing what your technical standards, what your standards are, and adjusting and making those more inclusive and accessible for students with disabilities.
Yeah, and we had one more comment that was added of it's hard for a student to know if they can meet the standards until they have had a chance to learn what is needed to be done and if an accommodation can be made to meet that skill. And I think that this really goes back to that point of having that specialized DRP, because when you have the person in that position, they can really speak intelligently to what the requirements are and work with the student proactively to figure out what accommodations would be the most appropriate.
And
So
that's such a great point too. In the idea that this is a student's first time experiencing a number of these things, they're not going to necessarily know the accommodations that they need or will need, or even what's available. And similar to this DRP specifically, that hasn't had this experience with students, with a student like Tammy before. And of course, each student is going to be different. It is likely that if there's another student who is a quadriplegic, they may need very different accommodations than Tammy, just because of any number of reasons. So yeah, definitely. I think it's a really great point. So thank you for putting that in the chat.
let's move on to question number 2.
All right. So now for question number 2, as a DRP, do you feel that you would have the knowledge to go through this interactive process with Tammy? And how would you prepare for a meeting with her? So I'm seeing in the key, Emily's grabbing the answer.
Do you have the toolkit? Do you have a link to that? I can't grab any links or anything.
Yeah, I don't have it offhand, but I will find it. I think it'll be available in the resources afterwards too. Let me see if I can pull it up.
I think we have a hand.
Yes, so Cassandra, I'm going to unmute you to allow you to talk. Go ahead, Cassandra. Oh, maybe it didn't work. Ask to unmute. If you want to unmute yourself, you would be able to talk.
Oh, I thought I hit it. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, thank you. So I would start by reviewing the technical standards and reaching out to the program to learn more about what would be expected of the student. So I have some idea when I sit down for the interactive process, and understanding that everything wouldn't be decided at that first meeting as well.
I think that's a good point of it's a fluid process. And so we might not get all the answers in that first meeting, but we're starting the process and we're going to work together to figure that out.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone want to put in the chat? They don't have to, if do you feel like you would be prepared to have this for conversation, or is there a reason why you think you might not be prepared to have this conversation? So Eileen shared that they would want to meet with the clerkship directors, want input from an occupational therapist. Great point. I think OTs are amazing, and I love it when people suggest that we reach out to them about accommodations. Thank you for that. Yes, reaching out to other DRPs at larger schools, or just, through the coalition listserv is a great, resource. And I think that, yeah, that idea of going to someone else who's had a similar situation, but to Sam's point of that, no two students are exactly the same, but, that's great. A great starting point. Let's see, Christine said they believe they could meet with the student initially, but would also need to consult with the department and faculty of the program to find out what is expected, what can and should be accommodated, and what cannot be accommodated due to federal law, health concerns, etc. Shadowing is always a great way to expose a student to many different environments and address questions. Yeah, I think that's a great point as well. The chat is lighting up, guys. I am loving this. Let's see. Brandy shared that fine about the conversation. The issue she'd run into is the technical standards. The program would push back since the students sign agreements that they agree to when they're admitted to the program. So great point about that, but we can't defend technical standards that are not legally defensible. So we also need to be thinking about that are our technical standards inherently discriminatory? Because if they are, then we really can't defend those technical standards, even if the student signed. The DRP should listen as usual to the student's current situation. Thank you, Dina. Olga asked, historically, is there a reasonable timeline for these type of requests? It's a great question. I don't know. Reasonable timeline, I think, for all requests, right? Of that, we certainly always want to have an answer to a student as soon as we possibly can. But I think that continually keeping the student in the loop. So if there is going to be a delay for any reason, I think allowing that student to just know that you're working on it. The one-on-one conversation with the student, what has the student used in the past and what was successful. Yeah, our students are the best source of telling us what works for them, right? Because we are not in their position.
100%. And I think even though Tammy's mentioned being a newer injury and so less aware of maybe everything she needs to be able to perform, she still had the injury longer than say the DRP who's just coming in and meeting Tammy for the first time. So while the DRP has some fantastic knowledge that Tammy has never even had to think about before, it really is getting to know the student and what it is that they need and are aware of.
Yeah, I think that, gosh, there's so much good stuff going on in this chat. I feel like we could spend probably all day on this question. We've got another point in here of patient safety. Patient safety is always very important, but there has to be that direct threat. So I think that going directly to patient safety, we want to be thinking about, I think a little bit broader.
I'll talk slower too. Apologies to the captioner. Get so excited. I think that just goes to show how passionate both of us are about this topic, is that we both like to talk rather rapidly. But yes, we will work to slow down.
And then the last comment is that the discussion should begin in the first year, long before clinical rotations begin, to allow a lot of time for learning about the student, the program, and appropriate accommodations. Dina, I think that is an excellent point. I hope that everyone reaches out as early as possible. Certainly when a student has a physical disability, it's easier to pinpoint, and they're probably more used to reaching out for services. But starting that conversation early is really important. Joe's added Tammy's physician or PT or OT, if she's worked with them, might have some specific insights and recommendations that could be useful. I think, yeah, again, the OT PT section is
it may be important to consider too that depending on, I guess this is likely longer in Tammy's time at this medical school, but if she's coming from a different location, it's possible that the physician she's working with is not the physician she's always been working with. So she has likely had to transition her care from where she did her rehabilitation or where she was even before she started med school to now where her medical school is. So she may not have that relationship with a PT or an OT like she may have had at home. So then it may be a little bit of a challenge to navigate that new situation and getting to know not only these new clinicians, practitioners, but then actually working with them as she continues on through her process. And I did find, I'm just going to put in the webinar link so that people can just have it now, just in case, so that it's there as well. So that's the webinar link to the technical standards that was done by the AAMC, which has a lot of really great resources. So just pulling that up so you can pull it up and put it in one of your other tabs for later, rainy day style stuff.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so question number 3, who is responsible for contacting the clerkship director initially? And then what is the best way to determine the specific needs of the student with a disability?
And I also see a question in the chat about who might cover the cost of an OT to advise on this situation. And that's definitely a really good question. An important thing to consider is if that's something your like the medical school itself would be willing and able to fund, if that's something the Disability Resource Office. And my assumption, and of course, I don't have all the answers. I don't think we have all the answers. My guess is that it would be program specific or school to school specific. I don't know, Emily, if you have any more insight on what that would look like in terms of cost sharing, especially like students are already paying for medical school and that can be a lot. So
yeah, as far as the cost, anything that is approved by the office as an accommodation should be covered by the university. Now, if a student is receiving OT therapy because of an injury, that would be on the student. But if it's related to determining a alternative way that a procedure could be done, then that would be part of the accommodation process. And so the school should be handling that cost. Got a lot of the DRP or the DS office should be contacting that clerkship director first. Dina shared a great point of there's a power issue if a student first approaches the clerkship director. And again, another agreement of reaching for the DRP to reach out to the clerkship director first. What about, how do you all feel once you as the DRP have already reached out to the clerkship director? What is how do you encourage the student to communicate those accommodations past that initial meeting that you have, or past you initially contacting that clerkship director? Do you all have any strategies that you use with students in their communication with other preceptors or with residents? So someone had, oh, you got it, Sam, thank you.
There we go.
So Catherine suggested planning a follow-up with the directors so that they can problem solve together for anything else that might arise. I think that's a great plan, being proactive on setting a follow-up meeting. Lynn says developing a statement to explain only what is necessary to provide context for the need. Yeah, we don't want students disclosing more than they feel comfortable with. We want them to be sharing what their needs are, and they don't need to say why, right? I think for me, along the line of that follow-up and the developing, I think a statement is helping a student maybe come up with a script that they can share with their preceptor, so that they've already got something and they don't have to worry about coming up with something off the cuff.
And there's certainly a fair amount of stress on the student to begin with, being nervous about the actual clerkship, while recognizing, especially depending on the institution, if you're going to be graded, and that grade is very important, for your subsequent residency interviews, and then recognizing, oh, I need to have accommodations on top of this, and how are those going to be perceived by the attendings that I'm working with and the physicians, or even just staff members, and then how is this going to impact my grade? So I think that idea of having a script to kind of allow the student a little bit less stress to have something that's already there, to at least as a starting point, as having had those conversations. I think that's extremely valuable, especially as a student, recognizing it's nice to take one thing off the plate of nervousness and anxiety.
See, Cassandra's got her hand up for us.
Yeah, we'd love to have you answer again. You are currently allowed to talk, Cassandra.
Can you hear me this time?
Yes, it can.
Okay, so I think it would also be important to help the student feel comfortable or understanding, like it would be important to meet with the directors or clerkship directors prior to starting, so that the plan is in place and everyone knows what's going on and what needs to happen for the student to have the accommodation.
Yeah. Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's as much as you can do in the like the pregame,
Yes.
right? The pregame is so much better than trying to fix it when the ship is already moving or the
Right.
car's already running. There's an analogy, but obviously it's not coming to my mind now. But yeah, as much as you can do before, and of course, obviously, sometimes things come up. You see a
Right.
patient or there's a certain situation you just can't do, like you couldn't have planned for. But as much as you can plan, definitely having those discussions up front are so valuable.
Yeah, and in the chat, Dina added that once the interactive process is underway for clinical accommodations, a draft faculty notification letter is sent for review by the clerkship directors to continue the conversation and finalize the appropriate clinical accommodations. And then that final letter can be shared with those who need to know by the DRP and or the student. I use that strategy a lot too. Our clinical accommodations, for the most part, are going to be a little bit uncommon and unique. And I think that having those meetings with the clerkship directors ahead of time and reviewing the language that you're going to use is really valuable so that you ensure everyone is on the same page and there's not going to be miscommunication with the way that you've written something versus the way that they understand how you've written it. All right, why don't we go on to the next question?
And I'll just like pull out Lynn's comment too, the how valuable it is to have a self-written script that allows someone to tell their own story instead of communicating in it. Because, like oftentimes, especially if it's in, the situation of an injury or even just like a lifelong disability, it dramatically impacts someone's life experience. And so being able to share that in the student words, like that's extremely valuable for that student and for what it would look like moving forward throughout their clerkships and beyond. So then I'll open up the floor for question 4. And how would you actually go about determining appropriate and reasonable accommodations? So those things that are legally required by the Americans with Disabilities Act to be provided for students.
Oh, shoot, sorry.
And even if we need to make it a little bit more clear about like maybe even just considering for her OB-GYN clerkship. So we're not thinking about all of the clerkships, but if we kind of just narrow it down of how are you going to determine appropriate and reasonable accommodations for an OB-GYN clerkship?
Jackie added that they often communicate with the clerkship directors to ensure accommodations can be implemented. Yep, huge piece of that for sure. I'm thinking of like a 2-word phrase that's the first step if everyone wants to put it in the chat for us. Dina says talk with the clerkship directors. Jenna adds determine functional limitations and how they impact required duties. Yep.
I really like the be creative. I know that's probably not the 2 words you were thinking of, but the number of times that you simply need to be creative, because Tammy's situation is unique. Not all students are in wheelchairs, obviously, in medical school. And so it takes a little bit of a lot of adaptation and considering what is the right way to go about things and how and what is going to work best for Tammy.
I did get some hits on my 2 words though. Interactive process. We follow the process. I think that's certainly the first step. Olga's asked if would any of you mind sharing a template of their FNL? I mean, if you want to connect with me, I would be happy to share what our letters look like if you'd like. I see Joe's got his hand up.
Goodness, man, this is my one job is to watch for people's hands and I'm really failing. So I apologize to everyone that has raised their hand because I love hearing people talk. So thank you so much for people that are raising their hand. Joseph, I just allowed you to talk. So feel free to unmute and ask your question.
I think I just unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, then it worked. I think meeting with the clerkship director and sort of inviting them to think with you through all of the things that are on the written requirements of the clerkship, and even the sort of unwritten things that get you from one spot to another, outlining kind of what all of those are, and then envisioning how one might accommodate them. What are some of the challenges? What are some things you might need an aid? What are some things the student might be directing someone else to do? And would that meet the requirements depending on what your technical standards are or how your school processes things? But but to really kind of outline what are the essential elements, because there's a lot of things that, you know, it would be nice if a student can do, but that aren't essential. And to figure out, can you still accommodate those so that a student doesn't miss out on the kind of informal stuff that is part of the everyday clerkship, to kind of just normalize the student being a part of the clerkship like all the other students. And you know, in my experience in doing this in the past, I've found that clerkship directors some can be very rigid, but some can be very creative and kind of like the challenge of thinking about it. And I think putting it as a challenge, how can we best do this? And, you know, most clerkship directors have some interest in education because that's how they got there. So again, inviting them to think about how there are new ways you can teach someone to do this. But it would be, you know, I think it would be the DRP engaging in an initial conversation with the clerkship director, outlining those things, and then having the student involved in it as well. And then the last thing I'll mention, because this has come up in other seminars, is if your school has a simulation lab, that's a place where a student can practice, sometimes between clerkships, sometimes in the period between the preclinical year and the clinical year, just getting used to getting in and out of examining rooms, things like that. So I'll stop now.
You could share great points all day though. So I mean, you know, we all need to be very thankful for your contribution. Thank you so much. Those are great points.
Yeah, those are really wonderful. I just want to like pull out a couple things because I don't know, that was awesome. So thank you so much for sharing. And I love, again, if people are willing and want to raise their hand. I think one of the things that I want to highlight too is how valuable it is to allow students that opportunity to practice in like a low stakes environment. So I'll just kind of like share personally. So I am actually a paraplegic. You can't actually see this on Zoom, so surprise. One of those, the weird thing that happens when the pandemic and the cool ways of connecting. So I had a spinal cord injury back in 2013. So I am doing medical school in a wheelchair, different obviously than Tammy's situation. I don't have any alterations to my hand function, but it was something that the idea of being able to practice in kind of that lower stakes environment and having that additional time. So I have done my first 2 years of medical school, so just the preclinical learning. I haven't done my rotations yet, aside from my primary care clinic that I go in once a month now while I'm on my research years. But I was allowed extra time to work with standardized patients when I was learning some of those physical exam skills, just to be able to figure out where to place my chair and where I don't have much core strength, similar to Tammy. So how do I need to position my body in order to place a stethoscope on the right positions to hear the heart and lung sounds like the rest of my colleagues were hearing. And it meant so much to me. And the standardized patients were amazing, but it allowed me to be able to learn the skills that I know I will need and have used since. So I really just want to highlight how valuable that is to allow a space for students to practice that is kind of a lower stakes situation. And I see Joseph, your hand is up again, so I'm going to allow you to talk. So go ahead.
That was a mistake. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay. Very good.
I should lower my hand, which I shall do now.
That's cool. Well, now I see Cassandra. It's all right. I'm going to call on Cassandra then. So Cassandra, you should be allowed to talk now.
So you just made me think of a situation with a student in our nursing program. And unfortunately, sometimes we have to look at when it becomes an unreasonable accommodation, when it's an unreasonable ask, because it could become a point where it's altering the nature of the program, and being able to have that conversation can be difficult.
Yeah, those are definitely not fun conversations to have. That's probably the worst part of the job, to be quite honest with you. But we have to have them.
Right.
And that again goes back to, to also what Joe was saying of what is essential, what can be observed, how can that student still participate, still get the educational outcomes that they need from that? Or are they not an otherwise qualified student?
Mm-hmm.
Where's my mouse? Question number 6 now.
Oh, Did we do 5? Sorry.
I'm sorry, guys.
I
Listen,
think we still have to do 5.
I really, okay.
Sorry.
No one, I should not be in charge of this. I'm sorry. Okay.
There you go.
So what reasonable accommodations could you make for Tammy?
I just think this is a really good question, because this is when we all get to get really creative of what are the ways that we can allow Tammy to be able to have that good experience and get those essential experiences that she needs to have, and that essential knowledge that Joseph was talking about. Or even like, what are some reasonable accommodations you could consider for, the idea of her being in the delivery room, or helping to deliver a baby? Are there certain accommodations that you would need or think she would need in that situation that you've worked with before?
So Lynn said, consider site accessibility and purposefully place the student. 100%, yes.
Yes. Exclamation point. There are certain clinic rooms that are just not feasible. Thankfully it's better now, but definitely site placement is huge.
Let's see. Lynn also added, if it's possible, ask to have the rotation moved to later in the schedule to give time to be creative. Yes, and also thinking about the order of the rotations as well. Do we want a student who is going to be having to exert additional energy and possibly additional fatigue? Should they have surgery followed by OBGYN, or maybe have psych in between? Let's see, Dina added that the case states that Tammy has limited use of hands and legs. It does not state if she is ambulatory. If she is, can she use a small scooter and hand crutches? That may allow easier access to exam rooms, etc.
So that's it's definitely a reasonable thought. I think the case does say that Tammy's a complete injury. And typically when you look at like the medical side of things, when you're a complete injury, you don't have any feeling or sensation at the base of your spine, which then would also mean you wouldn't have any kind of motor function as well. So Tammy is likely completely paralyzed and would not have any amount of lower body function to be able to move. But in the instance that she was, or if it was a different student that would, I think it's important to consider that it's possible. Perhaps the student would utilize could utilize a different mobility device. However, then the question becomes, well, who would purchase that mobility device? Because often personal equipment, like personal medical equipment, is not covered by the school under the ADA.
The way that Sam describes the injury clearly shows which one of us is in medical school and which one of us has never been to medical school. Let's see here. Terry adds, the process of having the wheelchair sterilized before entering a surgical setting. This has been a challenging discussion with various opinions of what is required. I know the guide for equal access has some great recommendations as far as ways to sterilize the wheelchair itself. But I think that is an excellent point, right? Of that, how are we going to ensure that everyone's safety is upheld in that operating room or in those sterile environments? Lynn
Important to
adds,
consider if it's possible. So like if it's possible to have a second chair that remains kind of a clean chair, where that doesn't go out into the streets of Chicago or wherever Tammy is located. For example, like my school, I was able to thankfully receive a standing chair through a grant from the school, which is amazing, but that will be a very specific surgery chair that doesn't then see the light of day aside from the surgical suite. Of course, not everyone has that gift, but I think it's an important thing to consider, because it isn't just necessarily like, it's not just Tammy's safety. There's a number of people and stakeholders in this case that are important to consider.
yeah. Lynn adds to consider if there's someone at the site that can be a point person to continue the interactive process. I definitely think identifying someone, whether that's a human resources representative, since they are already working with employees in the hospital with accommodations. I think there's a lot of really valuable connections that you could make there. Just added the possibility of a standing wheelchair that might enable her to see better and participate. Definitely.
They're so cool. So I'll just say that on a personal note, they are very cool.
And then Cassandra added, consider fewer patients in a day to allow for the time it takes for her to go to the restroom or using elevators or writing up notes as well. Dina says fewer students may work in medical school. However, it will not generally be possible in a residency. So I think that, anything is possible, right? It depends on the residency. And that's part of where having those open and honest conversations with students, connecting them with career support, maybe also shadowing a physician, helps a student to really narrow in on what specialty is going to be best for them with their limitations that they have. All right, we want to save enough time for Q&A, so let's move on to question 6, if that's okay with everybody. There's actually time for question 6 this time.
Yeah. And then question 6. So how would you implement the accommodations, and who would communicate and actually coordinate those accommodations?
It looks like Olga had added a comment about what about pushback due to the need and concerns of how to manage and operate non-surgically if things go south, need for emergency procedures. I think those concerns are obviously valid, everyone's concerns are, and that's part of where that communication is really important. And sharing also that while a student may have limitations, that does not inherently mean that they're incapable. And sharing how these accommodations are helping with access.
So thoughts about implementing some of the accommodation we discussed. Oh, we see Dina has put in there that for us, it would be student affairs and clerkship directors who make sure the accommodations are shared with those who need to know, and questions are directed to the DRP. I'm kind of curious, how often is there some sort of iterative process for a lot of individuals at schools in order to ensure that things are being accommodated? Like, are students checked in on during clerkships? Is this some, to make sure that the accommodations they need are indeed happening and that things are going okay?
Lana shared that often that's considered the student's responsibility or burden. So if that is, are there ways that we could lessen that burden on the student? Dina says that they encourage medical students to meet monthly to check in and discuss progress and accommodations. if you have the bandwidth for monthly check-ins with all of your students, I am so happy for you. I think that is such a great idea. And if we can implement, even if they're passive check-ins, that's a huge win. And that's even if it's not monthly, even if it's bi-monthly, you know, something that could work for you in your office, you know. Olga says, considering the timelines per clerkship, we encourage students to check in as much as possible, discuss progress and or issues. Cassandra says, I encourage students to inform me if the accommodations are not being honored. Yes, we definitely want to make sure that students know what the process would be if they're not receiving the accommodations that they are approved for. And knowing that they'll be scared if they're not receiving their accommodations. So we need to be assuring them and reassuring them that we're there to support them, and that if something comes up to reach out. And then Christine just shared, yep, so pretty much what I was just thinking of, that students may feel intimidated to report any issues. Reaching out to check in with them and let them know that you are here to assist is helpful. Yeah, I think hammering home that, you know, we're here to support you, because that's what our job is to support students. And I think that's really, you know, that's hugely important.
And as a student, it means a lot. I'll just say, I feel like every DRP on this call, you guys don't get the thanks that you deserve. I mean, I'm sure you have appreciative students, but you guys are miracle workers. So this is me as a student of one saying thank you for all of you do, and keep doing it. Do we have any other thoughts about implementing the accommodations or communicating and coordinating accommodations?
Okay, well, oh, here we go. Dina shares that often students don't want to bother the DRP. It's important to encourage them. I cannot tell you guys how many emails I get where it's, I'm sorry for reaching out. I'm sorry for bothering you. It's like, it is my job. Like, I'm here to help you. I'm here to support you. So I think that sentiment is really important for students to hear, and to hear often. Olga shared that document and share the approved accommodations and or modifications. Documentation is paramount. And Dina shares it's often difficult for them to ask for help. Yeah, I mean, to reach out in the first place is difficult, but then if something has already been worked out and has been approved and is not being implemented, then that's another hill to have to climb, which is really difficult. So reaching out to the student during and after, it can be helpful to reach out to the clerkship director to reflect on what worked and didn't work, as well as that can be helpful for future students. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, and especially if you've got one clerkship director who maybe OB-GYN went super well, they were really creative. 3 clerkships down the road, the student has surgery. Let's get the clerkship directors together. Let's have them have a conversation. How did we get through this in OB-GYN, and how can we implement this in surgery? I think that's a huge piece of it, because if their peer has been able to do something, then they're going to be more inclined to be able to do something as well, in my experience.
Right, especially when you consider in medicine, no one has enough time. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. What a gift that is. And if it worked, like, don't fix what's broken. I'm just going to drop all of the sayings today. But how valuable is that? No, it's definitely.
All right. Well, in keeping mind of the time, the book club website. So we have a number of more book club sessions to go. This is only number 2. So registration is on the website. I Okay, because I've got my full screen share. I will put it in the chat, I promise. So if you've not already signed up for all of the book club sessions, please, we would encourage you, if you have the availability to please sign up. This is just a really great learning environment, and you're going to be a part of creating a resource that moves forward. So please go and register. Hi, Terry. And like I said, if you have any questions or, please do reach out. All right, let's see here. Okay, so where can you purchase the book? So we want you to read the to be reading the cases, so you need to know where you can find them. So there is a link to purchase the book, and there you can find it on Amazon, at your library. Many of the schools will already have it available for DRPs. And then questions.
Great. And so then now this is the section that we're actually going to pause the recording. So kind of to really allow people that